Hi, Maria Williams here. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I made these cards. They are called Waterfall cards, but Lawn Fawn came out with a Flippin' awesome die set that makes making these cards a breeze. So that's what I'm going to be using today. So here's the Flippin' Awesome die set from Lawn Fawn. It includes a long die that cuts the main strip for the mechanism, as well as three different squares and a few accessory dies, as well as three different banners and two different cutouts for the end of the strip where you pull to activate the mechanism. Here's the first card I made, and I learned something from this card because I put that strip at the top that says just a little note to say, and when I pull out the mechanism, everything works okay, but then when I try to push it back in, it catches on that. So note to self, not to put anything on that end of the waterfall mechanism. So here's my second card that I made with some discontinued paper from Stampin' Up! And I apologize, but the papers in this video are no longer available except for maybe the Doodlebug one. But I wanted to encourage you to look at your pattern paper that you might have in your stash, or when you're looking to buy new paper, maybe consider what you might be able to use for cards like this. So I have here two identical pieces of paper, and you can see where I cut out the mermaids. I cut three squares out with the smaller stitched square die in the set, and then I also fussy cut one to put on the inside of the card. Here's another one that I made from this really old paper. I almost hate to admit how old it is. It's from 2009, and the shapes are a little bit too large to cut with the small square, so I actually used the large square and then cut some slightly larger squares out of the cream colored cardstock and mounted those onto the strip. And it doesn't matter that the squares are a little bit larger than the die that is included in the kit, everything still works okay. It's just that it overhangs a little bit further, so you have a slightly smaller tab, but it really doesn't affect the mechanism at all. I have taken out of the packet the dies that I'm going to use. I'm not going to use any of the banners for this card or the heart or one of the pulls. This is the main die, and here are the squares. The largest one is meant for the backgrounds, and then the other two are pretty much the same size, but one of them is a stitch square and the other one is a scallop square, as you can see. The paper pack that I'm going to be using is this Doodlebug 6x6 pack. It has some really cheery pattern papers, and I used this last year and I have a lot of it left over, as you can see. So this paper pack, like many others, has some larger designs that you can use to make cards, and I thought that these would be great, and actually they are the exact size of the stitch square. And because the fit was so tight, I decided that I was going to cut them with a paper trimmer instead of using the dies, just because I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to line them up just right, and I thought it would be just as easy to cut them with my paper trimmer. The first thing I'm going to do is show you how to cut the main strip for the card. It's a very long die, and so my cutting plates, I'm not exactly sure if there are longer ones than these. I will look and have links to them if they're available, but my plates are not long enough for the die to cut all at once. So I've already cut a full sheet of cardstock that was 8.5 by 11 in half at 4 1/4, and so that gives me my card base and also the strip the strip of cardstock that I need to cut the die. So I'm going to line up the die in the middle of my piece of cardstock and use some tape. This is not regular tape. I know it's a little bit deceiving, but this is my favorite tape to use for die cutting. It's Scotch repositionable, or actually I think that it's called removable tape, and I think it's awesome. I don't ever have any issues with it. So I'm going to use a couple of pieces on the die just to hold it in place, because I will have to readjust my plates. Once I have the tape in place, I'm going to make my sandwich, and I'm going to run half of the die through the machine, and then I'm going to take it out, realign the other half of the die, and put that through the die cutting machine. And you can see that the die cut already has the score lines that I'm going to need for my waterfall card mechanism. It is important to reinforce all these lines to make sure that the mechanism works properly. So I'm just using a Teflon bone folder here to make sure that my lines are really well defined. Next, I'm going to cut out 4 squares using the largest square die from the set, and then I'm going to trim out my pattern paper designs. The paper trimmer I'm going to be using is a rotary paper trimmer, and the reason I'm using it is because on the white strip where the blade runs along, you can see exactly where the blade is cutting. So it's really easy for me to align this square pattern paper and cut right in between the two designs. The other thing that's great about a rotary trimmer is that if you do make a cut that's a little bit off, it's easy to trim off just a little sliver, whereas I can't really do that very well with my Stampin' Up! Trimmer, which has the basic blades. Even though I only needed 4 designs, 4 squares for my card, I went ahead and cut out the entire sheet. And then after way too much deliberation, I settled on 4 designs. And I used some multimedia matte glue to glue my pattern squares onto the cardstock squares that I previously cut. And the cardstock that I'm using is Crumb Cake from Stampin' Up! And I'm using just a Stampin' block to put on some weight onto the glued pieces to make sure that everything stays nice and tight. I have all my squares ready to go and in the order that I'm going to place them on my card. So I'm going to start gluing them onto the waterfall assembly. So to do this, I'm going to start from the bottom up. So the bottom square of this strip has to have glue all over it, and you're going to place your first square there. My plan was to use fast fuse for the entire card, but I ran out of that really quickly, so I had to move on to this 1/2 inch double-sided tape. And I have these new scissors that are non-stick. They are great. Nothing sticks to them. So anyway, you could use liquid glue, but I think it's easier if you use a dry adhesive, either a tape runner type or something like what I'm using, but it's up to you. So I'm just going to go ahead, and since this is protected, I'm going to go ahead and put all my strips of adhesive down at one time, and then I'll glue on my squares. At this point, I'm adding the adhesive to the tabs that are going to attach the mechanism to the card. So basically, all the glue goes on the same side of the strip. Once I have all my adhesive down, I'm going to peel one section at a time and attach a square. And I find that the easiest way to attach the squares is to go ahead and fold the strip where that square will line up, and just line up the left side and the top. Just pay attention to those two sides and line it up, and it lines up perfectly. So I'm just going to do the same thing for the 3 squares, and then that's all the assembly that's needed for the main mechanism. I like to choose my background paper once my mechanism is assembled, since there's so many colors. So I'm just kind of checking out some of the papers and making a selection, and I settled on the paper that has the Christmas trees on it. So I'm just going to cut a piece that is 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches so that I have an 1/8 of an inch border all the way around the card. And then I'm also going to choose a paper to make a pocket for a gift card. Lawn Fawn does have a coordinating die set that creates a little pocket for you, but I figured it's so easy to make I would just make my own, but I will have a link to that die set as well. The key to making the pocket is to make it so that it doesn't interfere with the mechanism by always being a little bit tucked inside of the mechanism, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. You don't want the pocket to be really thick, so I'm using, as I said, another piece of pattern paper to create it, and I'm cutting it at 2 1/4 by 4 1/4. And then I'm going to cut off a corner, kind of on the diagonal on the long side, just to make the pocket a little bit more interesting. And then I'm going to score it at a 1/4 inch on the 3 sides that are 90-degree angle from each other. I will then cut off the corners at an angle so that I don't have any extra bulk, and I will fold along the score lines, being sure to really press down, reinforce the seams so that the pocket lays nice and flat. So here's how the pocket is going to fit. It's going to fit just under that very last square, so that when the card is when the strip is fully extended and you're down to the last square, the pocket will still be tucked under. If it was to come out, it would be hard to push it back underneath. It's important to do this before you attach the mechanism to the card, because then it's really easy to put the glue on and attach it. If you were to attach the mechanism to the card first and then try to glue the pocket, you would have glue on an end where you have to tug it under, and it could get pretty messy. So I decided to use liquid glue here, so I'm just lining it up to the edges, and then I'm just going to tuck in the a gift card that is already used into the pocket, just to make sure that there isn't any glue impeding the free movement of the card within the pocket. And then I'm just going to make sure I press it all down, and then I'm going to set it aside to dry. It won't take long at all, but in the meantime I'm just going to attach the pattern paper that I have selected for my background to the front of my card base. I then decided that I wanted to cut out the little tabs that are going to indicate where you need to pull. So I'm just taking that die with another piece of paper from the paper pack that happens to be red on one side and green on the other, and I'm going to die cut the tab. This die cut has 2 pieces, and I'm going to glue the larger piece with the red facing up. I'm just using some liquid glue. I'm going to line that up, and then I'm going to take the triangle that it cut from the inside and flip it over and use the green side. And I was hoping that it would be perfectly symmetrical, and it worked out okay. And then, just to make sure that it was well pressed in and adhered, I used my bone folder just to press it all down. Okay, so now I can finally attach my waterfall mechanism to the front of my card. So all I have to do is remove the adhesive from the 2 flaps, and I have left the gift card in there just to make sure that when I put a new one in, that there's enough room, that the tabs don't press down too tightly on the mechanism and make the pocket too tight. So I just press those 2 tabs down, and that's it. And there it is. It works like a charm every time. So easy and so perfect. To finish off the inside of the card, I cut out a piece of Neenah 80-pound cardstock to 5 1/8 by 3 7/8. And I also cut a piece of red paper from the same paper pack to 5 1/4 by 4 inches. I'm going to use this Ariel stamp set to stamp the Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas sentiment in old olive ink from Stampin' Up. And then I'm just going to mat these 2 pieces together with some tape runner and just attach it to the inside of the card. And the inside of the card and the outside will be complete. The second card is put together the same way, except that I set it up horizontally instead of vertically, and I did not create a pocket for a gift card, and I did add a sentiment to the front of the card. This time, instead of using the large square die to cut the background squares, I just used my paper trimmer and cut the squares to the same size as the die, which is 3 3/8 by 3 3/8. And then I used this paper pack as my base for the designs. And essentially, I just did the same thing as I did with a mermaid card, and picked out 4 different images and trimmed them out with the stitched square die. I wanted to point out that in my squares there are little bits of the images that are surrounding the main little critters, and I think that that's okay. So when you're looking at your paper and trying to choose what to cut out, don't worry if you have partial images around the edges. For the background, I've chosen this other paper from the paper set. This is retired Stampin' Up! Paper as well. And I'm going to cover the entire front of the card. I'm not going to leave a border at all. So I'm trimming this down to 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. I've already cut my mechanism strip out of some white cardstock. This is 80-pound Nina. And I'm folding it so that I can see exactly what the strip is going to look like once the mechanism is completely open. I want to make sure that none of my sentiment is covered up. And so I'm just using some VersaFine black onyx ink and just a block. Notice I didn't use a MISTI for any of this. I feel like the sentiments are forgiving enough that it didn't matter if they were a little bit off. So yeah, so I'm just inking up my stamp and stamping my sentiment. And then I fussy cut that little, is it a chameleon, out of the paper, and I'm just going to glue it around the sentiment just for a little bit of added decoration. Next, I will assemble my squares like before, just with some liquid glue, put them all together. Then I will adhere all the adhesive to all the areas of the strip that need it. I do still prefer to use liquid glue on the full square, so the first one that goes on all the way at the bottom of the mechanism. But then I do like the double stick adhesive. Apologies for all the crazy hair that keeps coming into view. I'm not die cutting an arrow or anything for the tab this time, so instead I'm using a stamp from the Push Here stamp set from Lawn Fawn. It has all kinds of messages for interactive cards, such as push me, press me, open me, shake me, all that kind of thing. So I'm just using the Pull Here stamp, making sure that I stamp it the right direction. And then I'm going to stamp Hope You Have an Awesome Day from the Critter Concert stamp set, which I used previously on the mermaid card. And I'm going to trim it out with my mini guillotine trimmer. I love this trimmer for sentiment strips. I think it does an awesome job. And now all I have left is assembly. So I just need to glue my I just need to adhere the pattern paper to the front of my card, and I'm just doing that with tape runner. Then I attached the sentiment just with some liquid glue. I really didn't want to create any extra volume where the recipient is going to be holding the card. And then I just peeled off the backer of the double-sided adhesive from the Waterfall mechanism, adhered that to the front of the card, and that completes my card. I love the way this card turned out. I did have to sort of fuss a little bit with the mechanism to make sure that the little chameleon would fit through, but once I ran it through a couple of times, it worked perfectly fine. So here are all the cards. I hope you get inspired. I hope you look through your stash of pattern paper and that you find some to make a card with. These are really fun and easy to make. Have fun! For links to the products I used and still shots, please visit my blog at mariascardsandmore.com. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.